It is good to be with you in this hybrid format, and I'm very excited that you are here in this workshop to discuss something that might be a little bit difficult to discuss. My name is Reverend Sara Fisher, and I'm currently living in Columbia, South Carolina, though I just spent 3.5 years in San Antonio, Texas. That is where I had the experience of leading a church to closure, so you will hear more of my story as we go through this seminar. I live here with my spouse. Jonathan is also Disciples clergy. He's an Army chaplain, and for those of you familiar with CPE, he's a CPE educator in the Army. We have 3 kids who are 10, 12, and 14, and a little dog that you may or may not hear depending on whether anyone gets close to the door while I'm recording this. If you are here, it's because you likely are starting to maybe feel some hunches, some nudges from the Spirit. I recognize that for some of you, this might be the first time that you've even maybe will say the words out loud that you think your congregation might be headed toward closure. I recognize that for some of you, even signing up for this seminar might have been a courageous step. So I invite you all, and all of us together, as we begin this time, to take a few moments of silence, to take a few moments to breathe and to remember that you are faithful and you are called and you are loved and God is with you. No one wants to talk about church closure. It is a difficult topic, and my hunch is most of us, when we started seminary and talked about our call story and the ways that we had experienced God working in the world, probably very, very few of us would have said, well, I believe that God is calling me to a ministry that will close down congregations. This isn't what we tend to imagine when we think about congregational ministry, and yet it is true for more and more clergy today. So as we move through this, there are a few things that we're going to sort of hold as realities. So I'm going to name them, but we're not going to spend a ton of time unpacking them. I think that we all have read articles and maybe books and had conversations about them, and so the one thing we're not going to do in this time is wring our hands about the way things used to be or, lamenting. Well, we might lament, but we're not going to just talk about the problem. We all can identify that. So there's some things that we're going to hold as true. The first is that there has been decline across the church in the United States. At large, there's been decline, not just in evangelical churches, but in evangelical churches, not just in mainline churches, but in mainline churches. There's a lot of reasons for that. There are a lot of contributing factors to that, and there is no one reason or contributing factor to that. But whatever that has looked like in your community and in your congregation, that is a reality. The church is not what it used to be, and it never will be that again. Another thing that we're going to hold as a reality, but not spend a lot of time unpacking, is the way that COVID, as well as political division in the last couple of years, has impacted this to a larger scale. There has been division for a long time. There have been differences of opinion for a long time. And it is also true that churches aren't closing because of COVID, but COVID, it's like held up a big magnifying glass around what was happening in such a way that many churches are probably having this conversation now that 2 years ago didn't necessarily think that they would be there at this point. So COVID has impacted the realities of our congregations. I think those are the big things that we're not going to spend a ton of time on, but we need to name that there's decline, that COVID has changed things, that our country's landscape has changed things. And it's up to us to sort of figure out then what is next. As I considered our process of closure at Rolling Oaks Christian Church in San Antonio, Texas, I will have some other books to offer, some other suggestions. The one book that I think impacted my ministry more than anything, and it's not a book particularly about church closure, but it had a lot of lessons, was How to Lead in Church Conflict, it's called. Lyons and Mosley are the authors, I believe. It's green and blue on the front. It's called How to Lead in Church Conflict, and the subtitle is about healing ungrieved loss. So while this book is a lot about conflict, and your congregation may or may not be experiencing a lot of overt conflict right now, I would recommend picking up that book, especially if you're toward the beginning of this process. One of the things that it talks about a lot is that a lot of conflict that churches go through, and I think this is true in a lot of different kinds of relationships, can sort of be traced back to grief, can be traced back to loss. If you think about what your church looks like on a Sunday morning right now, and what that same church looked like on a Sunday morning 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, it's probably very, very different. And sometimes the way anger, or sometimes what comes out as anger in congregations is grief. Maybe grief that the children that they raised in that church didn't stay in that church. Grief that as young people, they had hopes and plans for this congregation that haven't quite happened. Maybe grief for folks who grew up in the church, that it isn't what they remember as kids. So if you're at the beginning of a process, maybe just starting to realize that despite all the transformation efforts, despite consultants, despite new ministry, this might be where your church is going. I invite you to spend some time in the next couple of weeks, maybe, thinking about what grief might be under the surface. Leading a church through a closing process is full of grief, and it can be full of a lot of different kinds of conflict. So by starting out acknowledging that the church isn't what it had been or could have been, that can sometimes help us release that. It can help us not focus so much on that so that we can better make decisions for the path ahead. One key thing that I think is very important in that conversation, in pastoral ministry in general, but particularly as we talk about beginning a conversation around church closure. And this is something that I've worked with a lot. I did as a congregational pastor and have thought about a lot, is this tension that I have felt. And maybe as you think about it, maybe you have felt it too. This tension between pastoring individuals in the congregation. So think about that for a second. Think about health needs. Think about marital, relational needs in your congregation. Think about the individual, maybe family related or work related issues that your folks have going on in their lives. If you're like me, you can probably think through individuals in your congregation and think through so many pastoral needs that individuals in your congregation have. A lot of times as pastors, we focus a lot of our efforts on these individual pastoral needs because that's what's happening in people's lives. That is what we are called to do, is to care for people. But I think that equally important is pastoring the institution, pastoring the system, pastoring the group. So as you think about having these conversations, think about where that tension is for you and where maybe it's best to spend more time focusing on pastoring individuals, and when maybe it's time to take a step back from that and say, yes, we know that there's a lot going on in this congregation, and still we need to pay attention to some of these group dynamics, to some of this systemic infrastructure and the institution. I know sometimes we don't like to use that word institution, but really every congregation is. So there's a tension there, right? And as I have talked to colleagues going through this process of beginning to close, sometimes the thing that holds congregations back from doing some faithful discernment is they get too wrapped up in those individual needs that they lose sight of where the group, the system, the larger body might be led. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, recognizing that every church and every congregation and every community is different, so my story will not perfectly mirror your story, but I'll tell you a little bit about what we did and how the process looked for us. And then when we gather together for conversation later, I am happy to talk more about specifics in logistics, or to talk about maybe a broader picture if you have questions about any of that, or also maybe just to spend some time collaborating or in fellowship. You all are experts in your congregations, and you bring a lot of wisdom and experience to the table as well. So we can sort of be listening for what you want to talk about, and we can orient that time in whatever way would be most beneficial for most people. I also want to... Sorry, I thought there was a car pulling in my driveway. You hear the dog now. That was weird. I don't get a lot of traffic here. I also want to start by naming that as clergy, this is not just an abstract or theoretical decision. This is a decision that impacts us vocationally and personally and spiritually. Depending on your situation, where in your career you are, what other family responsibilities and help that you have, this might look a little bit different for each one of us. So I just also want to name that going into it, that as we spend time together, we don't all have the same situation, but the situation that we do all share in common is that we are called to this work. And I just want to affirm that even if you're here, and even if this is what happens with your church, even if your congregation closes, you're still a good pastor. And it is not a reflection on you that it's come to this. And in fact, I think that closing a congregation takes a lot of resilience and a lot of fortitude on behalf of the clergy. So even that you're here, well done. So when the other thing I wanted to say is that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the actual closing, like the last couple of months of logistics, the liturgies we did, the things like that we did. There will be time for that. My hunch is most of you here probably aren't quite at that point, so I'm going to spend more time focusing on early conversations. I first was called to Rolling Oaks Christian Church in San Antonio in 2018. I began in February of 2018. Now, to put some perspective around the situation that I walked into, when I started in 2018, they had not had a called, settled senior pastor there since 2012. So I will let you do the math and maybe fill in that any pastor walking into that situation knows that a gap like that means there's a lot of stories, right? And for Rolling Oaks, a part of that story was losing about 2/3 of their members, much of their budget, because of things that had happened years earlier. Part of that story was thanks to the work of an interim who did very, very good work with that congregation. They had already sold their building. So I'll name that that's a part of this conversation that I didn't have to walk through because they had already sold the building. I know there's a lot that goes into that, logistically, legally, financially, and also the grief that comes with selling a building. They had already gone through all of that and had begun renting 2 suites of like storefront space of a strip mall. But because I walked into that, I knew that it was going to be a difficult situation. The people that were there were incredibly loving. They were faithful. The way that I have phrased it to other people is, if you imagine a church of 150 people, but think about maybe the 20 or 30 that are your core people that are very reliable. It's like those were the people that were left, right? Those were the people that were still there showing up every Sunday. Attendance was 40-ish when I first got there, and that included kids and youth. So it was a dissonant situation because we were meeting in a storefront space because they had needed to sell the building, and yet it was vibrant. There were kids and youth. It was active. It was a lovely place to be. I realized that it was difficult to piece together their financial situation. And to be clear, I likely would not have stepped in. I would not have moved my family. I would not have moved to that situation. There were a lot of things that I couldn't really put my finger on before I got there. But my family was moving to San Antonio anyway because of my spouse's job. So it was a good fit and worked really well for me at that time. But as I started to piece together the financial situation specifically, I realized that it was not going to be sustainable long term. They had sold the building, paid off their mortgage on the building when they sold it. So that left them with about $180,000 in the bank. They used 20 to 30 of that to renovate the office storefront, the suite that they had, the suites they had two, that they had to make it workable for church. So when I got there, they had about 150 left in the bank. And there was sort of this feeling of non-urgency because they had money. They had savings, so they had time to figure out what was next. And after I had been there a few months, I did not have anything to do with financial records or anything like that. But I started seeing what was coming in on a weekly basis. And then I started realizing how much we were spending. And the difficulty, and this might be true in some of your congregations as well, is that much of our program ministry expenses were covered in kind. So in other words, deacons supplied all of the communion supplies. Sunday school teachers bought all of the materials for Sunday school. Any fellowship event was everybody just pitched in. Anything outside of utilities, rent, and personnel was covered in kind, which meant there were not a lot of places to cut the budget. There was no way to just reduce our spending because there wasn't anything to reduce other than rent and personnel. So I started realizing that where we were at was not going to be sustainable long term. Not just by a little bit, but we were using about $2,500 to $3,000 a month from savings on average. Some months it might have only been $500, some months it might have been $4,000, depending on what bills came in that month. So what I did, and if you are in a situation where a decline in financial resources is likely spurring this on, I offer this to you as something that was very helpful to me, because when I started to bring up, we don't have money to keep doing this for 5 years, 10 years, it didn't always feel like that to everybody because it felt like we had money. So I created an Excel spreadsheet, and I can even send you my template if this would be helpful for you. But I started with how much we had in savings. At this point, it was about 140 by the time that I started writing this down. And then I kept track of what our monthly giving was on average and our monthly expenses, and by the quarter, what that would do to our savings account. And this is when I realized that we were $2,000 to $3,000 in the red every single month. So I projected out. I started this end of 2018, so spring of 2019, our savings will likely be at this point. Summer of 2019, it will be at this point. And by doing that, by tracking our giving, our spending, and our savings account, I could project out when we were going to run out of money. There's an actual date on the calendar of when this was going to happen if nothing huge changed. And at first, the congregation and the leadership sort of felt like we need to do more outreach. If we get more people, we can keep doing this. You and I both know that $3,000 a month is a lot of new members, just realistically speaking. And this was a congregation that, like I said, we had kids and youth. Most of them came with their grandparents or great-grandparents. At one point, I realized that not counting pastors and pastor spouses, we had about 4 people between the ages of 20 and 60. So even though our average attendance was 40 plus, working age adults represented a very, very small fraction of that, which meant it didn't matter how many pleas, there are congregations that can send out a letter and say, we're $10,000 behind our, giving, and somebody will just write a check and cover that. That was not going to happen in this congregation. No one had that kind of resource. So I kind of projected out what was going to happen. I had already offered to cut my hours and suggested that we cut my hours. I was 3/4 time. I suggested we push it down to half time. And also, if you remember, we had 2 suites. And so I suggested that we look at what it would cost to move into just one. And that was met with a lot of resistance. And so I kind of backed off. I brought it up at first as suggestions, as, well, what if? And then backed off. And once I had that in black and white, once I could say, if nothing significant changes, this is not just me being pessimistic. This is math, right? This is actually what will happen. Depersonalizing it a little bit, having something that wasn't just my opinion or my perspective, but actually numbers in black and white on a page, that helped allow us to be able to make different decisions and have different conversations. Now, as a part of that, one of the things that I did, and I would strongly encourage you to think about this and maybe even have a conversation as you're able to have conversations with lay leadership about this, is how much do we need in the bank to close well? When this congregation had sold their building, because of other situations happening, it happened sort of all at once. They had an emergency board meeting on like a Monday night, voted on Tuesday, and they were out of there by Saturday or something like that. Like it was very fast and very sort of unintentional. They were reacting to it instead of acting intentionally. So I knew that it was not going to be good for anyone if we just showed up to church one week and said, can't pay our bills anymore, we're done. So for me, and because again, we had already moved out of the building, for us, that how we conceptualized closing well was 2 months of full worship with an extra month of salary for me. So 3 months of salary for me, so that month after our last worship service, I could spend doing all of the details, closing accounts, getting rid of the rest of our stuff, and having some very important pastoral care conversations as a part of that as well. So I think that if we were moving out of a building, that would depend on sellers, and if you planned to sell before you were disbanding, or some of those moving pieces. For us, that's what it was. So I had a number that basically, when our savings account gets to this point, that's what sets off that process that we know we're now 2 months away. Well, there were a couple of things that pushed that process along. My family found out that we were moving. We would be moving one way or the other, and our lease was up. And because of COVID and the restrictions of our building, we had not been able to meet in person. So again, kind of setting aside, unpacking all of that, the bottom line is we knew that it was coming, and so we had choices to make in that meantime. We had choices to make about how we were going to interact with each other. We had, choices to make about how we were going to worship and how we were going to show up in the community. And again, we started having this conversation before decisions needed to be made, because there's a lot of reasons behind that. But if you make them out of an emergency, then it's likely going to be a more difficult conversation. By starting this conversation kind of a couple of years in advance, we were able to have quality of life, right? We were able to enjoy the time that we had together. Also recognizing that we are people of the resurrection, and maybe it was going to turn around. But that was always sort of the tension that we had. Our guiding question those last few years was, how can we be the most faithful with the resources we have? Not how can we stay open the longest, but how can we be the most faithful? Not how can we pinch our pennies so that we can keep the lights on longer, but how can we be the most faithful? Not how can we try to get other people to come because we need them to give to the offerings so that we can keep our lights on longer, but how can we be the most faithful? That process was so beautiful, and it was faithful, and it contributed, I think, to our health as individuals and as an institution long term. So what that meant was I started here and there in sermons planting seeds of, we don't know where this congregation is headed. As we were talking about faithfulness, I started bringing up things like, if we were to need to close, here's some things that might happen. Just sort of starting to plant some of those seeds slowly. That book that I recommended earlier, How to Lead in Church Conflict, talks about not only grief, but it talks about play as well, which I really appreciated, because sometimes, and maybe you've been through this as well, maybe with a family, maybe your own family, if someone is diagnosed with a long-term, with an illness that will likely lead to their death, with a terminal illness, it can be really easy for everything to just get really sad all the time. And we're people of the resurrection. We are not called to be sad all the time. So we had moments of play. We enjoyed each other. We enjoyed fellowship. We were still active in the community. We still acted in faith that God was still living and moving and present among us. And also, there were times of grief. So as these seeds started being planted, I started having conversations, very frank and honest and transparent conversations with a couple of our key leaders, chair of the elders, and another person who sort of, they'd play musical chairs between who is board moderator and who is chair of the elders. In churches that are really small, it tends to be just a few people that end up doing a lot of things. And then sort of brought in the executive team, the core leadership of the church. And when I told them that we would be moving, it was very clear that this church did not have the resources, not just financial, but even the energy and the physical resources to go through another search process. And it wasn't going to be ethical for them to call another pastor when they were at that point maybe a year away from closing. This was end of 2022. I guess summer of 2022 is when we started having very intentional conversations within the congregation where I presented the same trajectory and also said, you can afford a pastor or a building, but not really both. But in those COVID times, we were meeting online anyway. We did some very serious discernment about what it would be like to move entirely online as a congregation. And for various reasons, some of which you can probably guess, but I won't get into right now, they really discerned as a congregation that was not what they wanted. But that was definitely one of the options. One of the options that I put before them was, I will resign. There were some other leaders in the congregation that were fully capable of preaching and that kind of thing. And I said, this is not my church, and it would help you in the long term if I stepped back right now even, or soon, and let you be a body together while you move through this season. And they also did not want to do that. So once we knew that those two options were off the table, we did some Survey Monkeys, which is a website that allows surveys, gathering information. So we did some of those, and I can share those with you so you can see the questions that we asked. I tried to ask questions that were specific but not leading, and got the information that I needed with also offering opportunities for open-ended comments. That worked really, really well, because then we could say, here's where the congregation is right now. We also, a few times throughout this process, but even early on, we had a couple family meetings, like congregational, we called them discussions. We were very clear that these were not congregational meetings to make a decision, but they were like town hall sessions that we could talk about together. And the first couple, we had some brainstorming and offered different ideas. But throughout this whole thing, I was very transparent with the realities of the church and what that trajectory was. As we went through this process, though, when it started getting a little bit more clear that we were likely headed toward closure, but before that decision had been made, I offered a listening session that was a place to just talk about how we felt. And if you've never done that before, it's a lot more countercultural than we might think, even in church. I had noticed that when we had done any of these listening sessions before, once things started getting a little bit too sad or a little bit too emotional, somebody would have an idea like, well, but what if we just meet in a school instead? Or what if we hosted a spaghetti dinner to raise some money? And I noticed that those ideas, that some of them were a little more feasible than others, but none of them were going to address the long-term sustainability of the church. I noticed that we started getting hooked in those. So after we had had some of those meetings, but before we were to the point of a vote, I held another discussion. And at the beginning, I said, if during this meeting you have a suggestion or an idea or a solution, I'd like you to write that down and just hang on to it. But for right now, we're going to put some boundaries around this space. And this space is not going to be for ideas or suggestions, but is only going to be an opportunity to talk about how we feel as we have this conversation. And let me tell you, that was probably the best thing I could have possibly done, because it alleviated folks' desire to come up with something else that we could try, and instead focus on the reality of our situation and to be present with it. That meeting was really a turning point for the congregational discernment. I think I'm going to stop there, because so far everything that we've talked about has been not quite to the point of decision making, but more about opening up this conversation and how to address it pastorally within your congregation. So I'm going to stop there, other than I will just sort of finish the story again for a little bit of context, which is very early January 2021, I met with some key leaders to specifically talk about this impending decision that needed to be made. And then that sort of branched out. I branched out circles to more and more leaders and faithful members of the congregation, even before we got to the point of a vote, and realized that at this point I'm addressing them as individuals, addressing them pastorally as individuals, and realizing that without exception, when I said, I think we need to have a decision about closing the church, and I think that might be where we're headed, it was like every single person audibly said, yeah, I think that's probably best. And then there was some relief, and then we closed so beautifully and so well. We ended up having another, so that was early January. Mid-January, we had another congregational discussion, listening session where we presented everything, talked about everything, gave everyone an opportunity to share. And then on January 31st was our actual meeting. That did not take very long, because at that point we had already hashed through everything. And so we decided to close, and you can actually read online the letter that I wrote to the congregation that day. And then our final service was on Easter Sunday, on April 4th. And that was a celebration of life. It really, really was. So I will end there and just look forward to our time together. I'm happy to talk about anything you want to talk about, whether it's logistics or your own feelings in this time or something else. I'll leave you with one other book recommendation, and that's The Art of Gathering by, I believe her name is Priya Parker. I don't have it right here. I'll look it up. But this book is not specifically faith-based or about church or about Christianity, but is about why we gather as people. And that, I think, could lead to some really good discussion as you start to begin this conversation in your congregations. Again, I will say, this is good work. It is holy work. You are faithful, you are called, and you are loved. I'll see you soon.